Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you.
Good evening, Carl Lee.
Good evening.
Good
Nice to meet
evening. It is an absolute pleasure to meet you finally. Now, for those of people at home who, well, they won't know this, but we've been trying to set this up for a little while. It's been a little bit, we've been crisscrossing with our schedules and all sorts of things have been happening, but we're finally here, and we've arranged specially to chat around 10 p.m. at night. So it's I very much appreciate your time this evening. But you are the stone tool maker who made those beautiful stone tools that featured in the movie Alpha. Whoop, hang on, too much glare there. Alpha, which I reviewed here on this YouTube channel not that long ago. And you got in touch on the back of that review and offered to send me over a beautiful, beautiful stone tool. I very much appreciate your efforts and work. And I suppose just starting at the beginning, how on earth did you get into making stone tools for a living? Never mind for a production, just in general. How did you start?
Well, it was one of those things that I guess I got to take it right the way back to a teacher. Who it was one of those real inspirational characters that you never forget.
Yeah.
And I going way back to studying at GCSE now. And he sparked my interest in stone tools by going out field walking. So we were actually going out finding the real thing. And it was an appreciation of the craftsmanship of those tiny pieces I was finding. Because I live in the Forest of Dean, so we don't generally find anything huge.
No.
And I was so fascinated by these things that he just one day said, well, why don't you have a go at making them? And that was at a time, should I say, pre-internet.
Yeah.
So I didn't know there were any other flint knappers out there.
No.
I started in earnest and produced an awful lot of rubble before I started to produce anything that really looked like the real thing.
Okay.
But an addiction was born.
Yeah. Well, so how did you start to? Sounds like you taught yourself, but how did you start that process?
It was really just trial and error. We knew what original tools had been found for working flint. We had soft hammers found at Boxgrove that still had tiny pieces of flint stuck in the hammer face.
Yeah.
So we had a whole series of evidence pieces like that. And of course I had the original stone tools, so it was just a case of striking edges at different angles to become familiar with the material.
Okay. And did you go on to study archaeology at all, or did you go from school into this as a profession? I mean, what was your career trajectory in that sense?
I went to uni.
Yeah.
And became an archaeologist, but the passion for flint really overrode everything else. So I started to study stone tools and replicate them, and it just seemed a natural progression then to move on to teaching and demonstrating the skills.
Wonderful. So the flint had sparked a passion in your life, yeah.
You can say so, yeah.
Cool. This is gorgeous. Although you did ask me not to hold it sideways on because it is a bit.
Oh, you swine!
I'm an absolute swine. But I think this actually indicates, or is because of one of the most interesting features of this particular a tool that you've made here, and that is the nodule within it. And you were saying this is a fossil caught within the flint itself.
Yeah, I mean there's several things to say about that really. We're limited with some of the British flints, just how much we can thin things down because of the fossil content.
Yeah.
I mean, I suspect the reason we find some of the most beautiful Solutrean points on the continent is because they had flint that was better suited to it. We do have some British flint that you can really thin down. I've got a couple here, if you can see those.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and they're actually more kind of the average size
yeah,
of the
yeah.
points that we find.
This is quite large. Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, it's quite comical really because everybody thinks that Salutrian points should be a foot and a half long, super thin,
Uh-huh.
and in actual fact, the ones that you see illustrated all the time, I call them the poster boys for the Salutrian.
Uh-huh.
There's actually only a dozen of them, and they were all found in a cache in Salutre,
Yeah.
and they all appear to have been the work of the same person. And I have to say, it's a person I would have loved to have met because it's basically genius.
Yeah.
I mean, working from a slab of flint that's been sawn down
Uh-huh.
to produce something thin is relatively easy, but working something from a round nodule and producing a usable flake and then thinning it, that's where the real skill comes into it.
Absolutely. Now I want to get into that in just a second,
Okay.
but just before we dive into that, can we explain just for the boys and girls at home what makes the Salutrian stone tool industry so special?
I think the simplest thing to say to that is it was way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
They were incredibly difficult tools to make,
Mm-hmm.
but we're talking about something that appears 22,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And we don't really see the like of that craftsmanship again until the Bronze Age,
No.
when we see the appearance of the Bronze Age daggers.
Mhm.
So for this to be an Upper Paleolithic tradition is pretty outstanding. It really does stand out against everything else from the period.
Well, and crucially, it stands out because of human craftsmanship. It's not one of those things where people feel compelled. Well, oddly enough, this period hasn't been picked out by those alien conspiracy theorists to sort of go, oh,
No.
alien, no one
Yeah,
seems to
wait,
notice.
this goes out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they'll be, aliens. But it is all about the craftsmanship, and so, in that sense, because obviously. Sorry, the closest analogy I can think of, because I have been in and around nappers, I've tried napping myself, but just kept on shredding my fingers. But the closest analogy I can think of it is a sculptor or a sculpture. And one of the things I know about sculpting, for example, in marble, is that you know a good piece of marble by hitting it, striking it, and hearing the ring of the stone.
Yeah.
And is that the case with flint? Is that how you go about starting with that slab type situation?
Yeah, I mean, if you're sourcing raw materials, I mean, I head to the quarry, and the only tool you need is a pebble,
Right.
and you can just clamber over the pile of nodules, tapping every single one, and you're selecting by sound.
Yeah, yeah, and presumably is that because a pure sound will reflect a homogeneous sort of content to the stone,
Yes.
so you're less
yeah.
likely to come across inclusions or things like fossils in the middle of your tool, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, if you look up any description of flint, it's always described as a homogeneous material.
Yeah.
But you've only got to look at the piece in your hand to see that it's, in reality it's anything but.
Absolutely. Now, actually, in that sense, something that I've always wondered is so flint, as you say, it's described as homogeneous, but there's definitely a crust to it, and there's a central bit. There's often a sort of a whitish crust and a dark grey to caramel-esque centre to flint. Do those two different sections have different qualities, or is it actually the same all the way through? It's just that the outside has been exposed to heat or something else.
No, it's completely different properties.
Right.
The outer crust or cortex tends to be quite chalky and very brittle. It doesn't really hold a sharp edge at all.
No.
So that's why when we find any really nicely crafted tools, the cortex is either completely or mostly removed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in that sense, what that brings me on, I suppose, to my next question. So much as, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that one is looking for in terms of that central material? Is it that it will break in a certain way? Is it closer to shattering, or is it closer to sort of chipping? What sort of qualities are inherent to the core of the flint that makes it useful for making a tool?
It's purely the ability to produce a nice, strong, sharp edge.
Yeah.
as soon as you start removing flakes from a nodule, you can tell the quality straight away. But as I mentioned earlier, the biggest problem that a flint knapper will encounter is fossil content.
Yeah.
We also find crystal cavities, chalk cavities, voids, and each has to be dealt with in a different way. But if you have very fossily material, you'll find the shock wave will run through the flint perfectly. But as soon as it hits a fossil, as you can see on the example you're holding, it's standing proud of the rest of the material.
Yeah.
And it's because the shock waves will run up to it and just stop. So that makes thinning incredibly difficult from that point forward.
Yeah. Now these shock waves, I don't know if they're still called this, but I learned them as being ripples of percussion almost. These are almost like ripples that are caught frozen or from the actual act of striking. So does, when you strike the flint, does it actually move and ripple, or is it more that it fractures and ripples? Is that what's going on?
It fractures and ripples, so it's a solid record of a shock wave.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Cool. Okay. Now I was curious when I saw this one, because I showed it immediately to my wife, and she spent some time picking up flint at Butzer Ancient Farm. She was collecting flint from the fields there, and she also shredded her fingers doing that. And so we were both very gentle with the edges of this one. But one of the things that we were both wondering was, in your opinion, is if this tool was used and it struck something, would it be more likely therefore to break at the fossil then, at that inclusion? Would it sort of shear down the middle there, do you think?
It's far more likely to break at that point, yes.
Yeah. So that is essentially a weakness in the tool itself then.
Yeah.
Okay.
If there was an impact, it would kind of resonate through to that point.
And then
snap. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, funky, cool. So thank you. You've answered lots of technical questions I've been dying to ask ever since I picked this thing up.
No problem.
But obviously, again, as I say, you came to my attention with me having commented on the movie Alpha, and at this stage, I'm fascinated to know who approaches who. You know, how does one become a stone tool prop maker for a Hollywood production? Were you just sort of called out of the blue?
I was contacted by Albert Hughes, who asked if he could come over and meet me in the Forest of Dean.
Yeah.
And obviously he's from the States. I wasn't sure if his geography was that great for the UK. But I did explain to him that driving over from London was going to take him something like 4 hours, and probably something similar to get back. And he said, not a problem. So I think one of the funniest things I've seen in many years was Albert and Andrew Rona bouncing down my potholed country lane.
Yeah.
In a chauffeur-driven limo.
Oh wow! Okay.
So yeah, that was quite comical. But yeah, he came here. He stayed for, I guess, 4 or 5 hours, and we had a good chat. I made them a Salutrian point, and he just said, "We have our flint knapper," and it really was as simple as that.
Yeah. And what was it? What was it then, as far as you're aware, that they were after from a flint knapper? Was it consistency? Was there a certain visual quality that they needed in the props? And indeed, what sort of control did you have over how these things looked on camera? Because the tools that we see, for example, when Kader and his retinue are practicing, trying to pass the test at the beginning of the film, they're real showpieces. They're beautifully symmetrical. There's some wonderful pressure flaking going on. It's just gorgeous stuff. And where did that come across? I mean, the aesthetics in that sense.
Well, initially, they wanted everything to be as accurate as possible.
Yeah.
So I'd had recommendations from Jill Cook at the British Museum and Nick Ashton, and that's what directed them to me.
Yeah.
And I've got to say, my condition for being part of the project was that they would do it as accurately as they possibly could, because I've done many things in the past, and the promise has always been, we want to do this accurately.
Yeah.
As soon as you start the project, it's always the same kind of, well, we can only go with our budget.
Yeah.
So I did explain to them that really I wasn't interested in being part of it unless they were going to do a really good job at it.
Uh-huh.
And he said, that's music to my ears. He said, that's what we want to do.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So, yeah, they wanted pieces to look good. They wanted them to look pretty accurate. But what they didn't know, I mean, I've spent hours and hours going through the archives at the British Museum,
Mm-hmm.
and they had the same kind of misconception about Solutrean points as everyone else, that they have only ever seen the super thin works of art. But if you go through the drawers at the British Museum, you'll see that they weren't all like that at all. Some of them are quite thick and chunky, others are very short and stumpy. They weren't all works of art. And he said, that's great, that's what we want.
Yeah.
We want them to look real.
Mm-hmm.
But the most difficult part, if I'm honest, was they asked me to make some really bad ones.
Right.
And they were the ones that were the failures at the test, thrown in the fire.
Uh-huh.
And it was incredibly difficult because obviously you spend years learning the craft and striving for those beautiful points.
Mm-hmm.
To make some real nasty ones was really hard work. They were more difficult to make than the ones that you were just complimenting.
Yeah. Well, and is that because it becomes sort of muscle memory, or do you just sort of learn how to handle the stone in such a way that you accidentally create exactly what you're after? Is it hard to unlearn that skill? I mean, I'm trying to understand how it's difficult to make a bad tool once you know how to make a good one, if that's what I mean.
You're constantly reading the material, and you have to get a feel for it, because one piece of flint has different characteristics to another. So one piece you'll have to hit quite hard. Mm-hmm. Other pieces you really have to rein back on the power because it's more brittle. The flakes much easier. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, when it comes to Solutreans, you learn to hope.
Okay.
Because they can go at any time. The thinner you make them, the weaker you make them.
Well, and see, there's this idea of learning to hope. Again, I come back to this sculpture analogy. Was it Michelangelo who said, every piece of marble, there's something inside, I just need to bring it out?
That's right.
And do you think that you come to understand something of the aspirations of the people who are making these tools, in so much as they were probably, for example, one of the uses of stone tools is cognitive archaeology. It's the idea of thinking about how people thought about things in the past and their cognitive capacity. And so do you get a sense of that hope, as it were, coming through even in the bad tools, where they're aiming for something and it just goes wrong, goes horribly wrong, or not? I mean, you must have some sort of kinship with that, I guess.
I don't think you can get much closer.
No,
to be honest. I mean, you're repeating a thought process that's thousands and thousands of years old. Yeah. So there is that connection.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing if it hadn't been invented by the time we reach the Solutrean, that's exactly when we see the appearance of foul language.
Yeah. No, I can imagine that. Yeah, getting very frustrated. So close, so far.
That's it. So
okay then. So coming back to this idea of there being a test, I really liked that idea in the movie.
Yeah.
And what as far as you're concerned then makes a good blade? You've talked about the fact that you have these sort of essentially these sort of high end, these things that are held up as type pieces, which are super thin, and as you also have said, that the thinner it gets, the weaker it gets. What do you think would be actually the goal of a bread and butter Solutrean stone tool? Would it be to be thin and beautiful, or is there some other quality that they're after, do you think?
There was definitely an aesthetic tradition to it.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing the reason that they were making them so thin was penetration.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
It's going to give you far less resistance on entry to an animal.
Yeah.
So they had to be really thin.
And also, I suppose in that sense, it's a simple power transference, isn't it? If everything's being thrown and meeting a surface on a thin point is going to
Yeah.
go in much more easily. And actually, I'm just noticing now how beautifully transparent the tip of this is. Actually, it's just gorgeous. Um, so okay, now just before we started recording, you kind of threw out the idea that I could sort of query you about some of the other issues that I raised with the movie, as it were,
Yeah,
a little
definitely.
bit later on, and I suppose just before we get too far down that path, I'm just curious as to who was the technical advisor on the movie. Were you actually advising on more than just the Stone Tools?
Yes, I mean it kind of evolved. I mean I was involved from writing of the original screenplay. Um, so I had the writer Skype calling me and just firing questions at me about what life would have been like in the
Yeah.
Upper Paleolithic, how they would have dealt with injuries. So we talked about how they would have looked after themselves in the case of Cato where he had the accident.
Has to fix his own leg, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and he was quite interested actually in how they would have dressed wounds, antibiotic properties of plants.
Yeah.
We went into quite some detail with that, but then it kind of evolved. I went from advising on the script to advising on the sets and the props,
Yeah.
and then they asked if I would do the hand shots for the flint napping.
Uh-huh.
So it's actually my hands you see in the and yeah, I mean I was on set. I was out in Canada six times advising actually on set. So I was behind the monitor when they were doing some of the napping work and kind of directing their hands, if you like. But
Okay.
there was so much footage, there was only a fraction of it used. I guess that's normal.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah.
So yeah, it was kind of evolving as we went along, really.
Okay. But it sounds like in that sense it was a good working relationship, and I think that does come through in the movie. There's too much was entirely casually good about the film for it to have been someone just ignoring and going with merely aesthetic properties. But you mentioned props, and one of them that I highlighted in the review was this question of the bowl. Now I understand that you do get rocks that look a bit like bowls, but that was quite a hardcore bowl looking rock. And
It was.
I can understand that thematically it works as a dog bowl, and it sort of it helps the audience to come into that sense. Oh, this is a moment. But did you have anything to say about the idea of using a bowl as opposed to maybe a skin or bark or something in the Upper Paleolithic?
I didn't see it.
Ah, okay.
They shot that section after I'd come back, and I'm sure, to be honest, had and Jill Cook, who was the other technical advisor, she was back in the UK by the time they were shooting those sequences too. And I'm sure, had we pointed that out and just said, look, get a dished natural stone, they would have used it. But I think we just got to accept that the props team that were working on the film were not archaeologists.
No.
They were kind of a general fantastic props team, I have to say. But they weren't qualified archaeologists. They weren't experts in the field. So I guess it wouldn't have occurred to them to look for something more natural.
Yeah. Well, and actually, in that sense, there's so many other things that they get really quite right. I was very impressed, for example, with the clothing and with the fact that the clothes are very understated yet very well made. There's nothing. There's no. In that sense, everyone kind of looks the same, and I imagine from a cinematic kind of standpoint, it must have been very tempting to have distinct costumes for your hero and for your. But actually, I liked that. I really so yeah. As you say, they were clearly listening and they were clearly doing a good job. Definitely.
They weren't. I mean, when I mean that goes right the way back to the initial discussions with Dan, the writer. mean, he said, what would they have been wearing?
Yeah.
And I mean, the simplest answer I gave him was, if it's cold, look to the Inuit
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
look how they would have been dressing.
Yeah.
Because
or the Killer Kitsock mummies, for example.
yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Yeah.
they had a needle and thread.
Yeah.
So they were obviously they wouldn't have had a needle and thread unless they were making tailored clothing.
Yeah.
So I mean, that speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And I said, if it's a hot climate, look to the Native Americans, the kind of thing they would have been wearing, and they were perfectly capable of making the same quality of clothing.
Mm.
The
Exactly.
boots, I have to say, were fantastic.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's a couple of shots in the movie where you can see them actually kneeling down,
Uh-huh.
and you could be forgiven for thinking that they had a modern tread
Yeah.
at the bottom of the boots,
Mhm.
but they didn't. What the costume ladies did over there, and they were fantastic too, was they had a sheet of leather,
Mhm.
and they would put a twig across the sole of the boot, and then fold the leather over the top, and then stitch it through, and then make another fold. So you had this kind of pleated sole to the boots, and they were absolutely incredible and so comfortable.
But and I have to say that was something that I did take a second look at when I saw it. And initially,
Yeah.
I did rewind the film a little bit. I slightly cut myself. I did rewind the film a little bit to check out the boots. And as you say, it was a gorgeous, a gorgeous extension of what is possible. And I think that's something that frankly, experimental archaeology does. Never mind movies. So yeah, really excellent. How did you feel about the inclusion then of the saber-tooth?
It was contentious,
Uh-huh.
but I think, as you said in your review, which I thought was very fair.
Oh, thank you.
It's one of those things. It's a movie. There's always going to be certain aspects of it that are there for dramatic purposes.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't have been there, but at the same time, they had to create. You're right. It would have been much better if it had been a cave lion, but they went with the saber-tooth. We didn't know, because obviously that was all part of the later CGI stuff.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I don't think it really detracted that much from it.
No, I agree. And it's certainly not as egregious as some of the stuff that you see, for example, in 10,000 BC. And also as well, as I said, and also in that sense, I think by the sounds of it, you deserve some of the credit for this, in so much as I think it's excellent that they resisted the temptation to tell a story that wasn't bounded simply within a person's lifetime. And to put that another way, there was no metal that came into the movie. There was no monumental building. This was a Paleolithic story, and I think that was a really good aspect of the film. I thought it was really good.
It wasn't a year one. Was it Jack Black?
Yeah,
Jack took it through the ages.
Yeah.
No, I think they did a fantastic job, to be honest. I mean, cinematically, it's so impressive on a cinema screen. I think obviously when you're on set, you see a blue screen background. When you see it on the big screen, they've got the big impressive backdrops. So really, it was quite a surprise for us watching it at the cinema to see what they'd done with it. And I've got to say, I was really impressed.
Okay. Now, just in terms of scale and scope, then, was there any conversation about this idea of this ancestral pathway, the long journey that they go on to hunt one of their staple animals? Was there any conversation about that, and whether people would realistically live that far away from one of their key food sources?
There wasn't. I mean, I remember Joe Cook and myself were sat at the end of a table, and they kind of had a quick fire question session, and we had the whole cast there and the crew, and they were just firing questions at us about life in the Ice Age, how they would have survived, how they would have lived. We talked quite in depth about the kind of structures that they would have lived in.
Yeah, well, the
And
mammoth bone huts were there. That was excellent. Yeah.
exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
that was the example that I used, and
Mhm.
and they went with it. And I think Jill Cook used exactly the same example.
Yeah.
So, but they really did listen to everything I had to say. But this huge journey wasn't really brought into it when we were talking about it.
No.
So again, it was an aspect really that wasn't discussed, and we weren't aware of that huge long journey really until we saw it on the big screen.
Yeah. But as I say, it thematically it works, and it's a beautiful thing to have them passing through the landscape, as
Yeah.
opposed to, as I say, flying or driving or something, or some other, even frankly, even riding an animal. Actually, that's something I didn't even think about. They weren't riding horses or something like that.
Yep.
They were walking through the landscape, and so it adds to the texture of the film in another way, I guess. So I think
Yeah.
again, I think it was very forgivable.
I think it worked.
Yeah.
It would have been a very short film if the animals had just been over the hill.
Yeah, exactly. Kelly just goes, "Hello." Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well. You surprise me with a little tidbit as well a little bit earlier. The idea that at some point there might have been the possibility of Neanderthals in the movie, and
Yep.
that, I mean, obviously that would have been quite egregiously wrong in terms of timescale. But what happened there? Did a conversation have to occur? Did someone have to say no, kind of, or in terms of, you've achieved so much, don't do the Neanderthal thing, kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I guess there was aspects of that from myself and Jill Cook.
Yeah.
And I think they were playing with the idea for quite some time, but obviously that idea was cut from the final edition, and I'm really pleased that they did that.
Yeah.
I think it would have detracted from something that was largely or mostly an accurate film.
Yeah, and essentially a modern human story as opposed to a
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of how they were planning on representing Neanderthals, though? At least was there any discussion about linguistic capacity, this kind of thing?
No, there wasn't.
No.
I mean, it was very much that part of it was still very much at the discussion stage when Jill and I had finished on the project.
Right.
So I don't know how much of that would have been costume and makeup or CGI.
Yeah.
It wasn't really discussed that much.
No. Okay. It would have been interesting. Would have been interesting, but I'm glad it wasn't in there. Definitely. Okay.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, well, I said, given that it is quite so late, that this would be like a 20 to 40 minute interview. So I'm aware of how long we've been talking, and I just want to bring us towards a close by asking you, just coming back to sort of as a modern living human being who makes stone tools today, what, I suppose two questions come to mind. First of all, what use do you think stone tool and flint knapping has in the modern world? Do you think more people should know how to do it? And secondly, have you ever been in a situation where those skills have really been extremely useful? And in that sense, what's been the most useful modern stone tool you've ever had to quickly make to do something?
Well, I work with bushcraft companies, so there's been lots of courses that companies and myself have run to teach people how to make stone tools, and they've basically got to leave their knife at home.
Yeah.
They're making all of the tools either with stone tools or from nodules of flint, and it's a real eye-opener, and it's very satisfying for those people to sit down and make a stone tool. It's kind of like friction firelighting when you see somebody's face light up when they produce the first flame.
No pun intended,
you suddenly realise I'm one step closer to being self-sufficient in a dangerous situation. Same with stone tools. I mean, it's very satisfying to make something from a lump of rock that could potentially save your life.
Yeah.
But I've made things out of glass. Glass fractures in exactly the same way as flint, so I've made glass spear points and daggers, that kind of thing, arrowheads. But looking at it from another direction, I think the importance of stone tools and the study of stone tools takes us back to what we were talking about earlier. It's really as close as you can get to the thought process of a prehistoric person, because it has to be repeated in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
We know the tools they were using, and obviously we see the finished result.
Yeah.
So to produce something like a salutary spearhead or a hand axe or an arrowhead, you have to repeat the same thought process that was running through somebody's mind thousands of years ago.
Yeah, and presumably in that sense it's the same sort of roadmap. It's the same, as you say, process and progress through the tool as well. Yeah. I continue to be very impressed whenever I meet someone who does flint knapping and is so proficient. And one of the things that I often say to, for example, primary school children when they're learning about prehistory, is that in some respects stone tools kind of explain an awful lot of what we are. In terms of, we love symmetry, how we think about using our hands, and how we relate ideas to each other when we're teaching and learning and passing on skills. I often joke, but I think it's a very serious point to make, that if an alien landed in the playground and said, define yourselves technologically, tell us about who you are, we would have to fall back on the fact that actually we are stone tool makers. It's been 96.5% of our time on this planet. It's do you,
well, I was speaking to an anthropology class today, and I said if you had to pick one tool to represent the human race, it would have to be a hand axe, because it's a tool that we used longer than any other tool in our history. I agree.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so do you think that within
you're going to have to put that down, or you're going to cut yourself again.
I know. I just can't stop touching it and go, oh, it's so beautiful. You're right. Yeah, right. You're right. I really should stop. But do you think then, in that sense, within the stone tool and the act of doing and the act of sharing this stuff, that actually, as you say, there is this moment where people can connect with being self-sufficient and something innate to making and surviving if needs be. But do you think it also helps us to have a sense of actually the fact that we are all similarly capable as well, in so much as, I imagine, well, for example, have you ever come across someone who simply could not make a stone tool? If you see what I mean.
I haven't. No. I mean, I've taught a lot of people over the last 20 years or so, and I've had people that have struggled with it. But it's, as a teacher, it's really just a means of finding their way into a piece of stone. It may not necessarily be the way you would approach it, but we're very limited to the number of ways you can produce a stone tool. So you've got to kind of pick up on where they're failing, whether it's their hand-eye coordination or whether they're afraid of the stone. I've had people afraid of hitting the flint, terrified they're going to cut themselves, and it's overcoming those problems to put them back on the right track. But I've never had anybody fail to make simple stone tools. No.
And I think, it's just that it just brings us full circle. It illustrates people's capacity in the past, but it also reminds us of our capacities as modern humans still today, in that sense.
Absolutely,
well.
yeah.
It's a wonderful thing. Wonderful. Well, thank you for your time this evening. It's been a real pleasure.
Welcome. Thank you.
Finally, is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to share with us about this whole thing, especially this movie that you worked on that brought us together? Is there anything that a little fun little bit of information that you'd like to tell us?
Yeah, I guess there is one. Albert actually paid for our honeymoon out of his own pocket, which was incredibly nice. He is, I have to say, an outstanding guy. He's a lovely guy. and my wife actually introduced him to the Welsh cwtch.
Oh yes, yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah.
He'd never had a cwtch before.
No, well, it's the best. It's the best hug in the world.
Absolutely. He had a Welsh cwtch for the first time, but they were aware that I flew back from Canada. We were working in Vancouver, and I flew back the day before we got married.
Mm-hmm.
And I managed to get down the aisle with no jet lag effects. And then I flew back out 3 or 4 days later. So they knew we hadn't had a honeymoon. So on my next return, they said, just before I left, next time you come out, bring Lucy with you.
Yeah.
So we went out, had no idea what they had planned.
Uh-huh.
And when we got there, Albert said, we've rented you a car. Because on that visit, we were out in Alberta.
Okay.
And beautiful place. That's where they had the village overlooking the river.
Okay, yeah.
And he said, we've rented a car for you, and you're going to need it. So they said, we've booked you into a hotel. And we thought, great, fantastic. But it wasn't until we saw the tickets that we found that they booked us into the Banff Springs Hotel, which is a 5+ star hotel in the Rocky Mountains. So off we went for a lovely stay there.
Wonderful.
And a trip all over. And I was one of the highlights of that trip was we were able to go to a site that I've used in lectures for many years, and that was Head Smashed In.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Buffalo Jump.
Yeah.
We had a lovely day there. But yeah, lovely guy. Really cared about not just us, everybody on set. He was a director. He wanted things done, and they had to be done quickly. But I have to say, he was a really lovely guy.
Cool. Well, and in that sense, it sounds like that sort of passion was there from the beginning in terms of what he wanted to achieve in the film and the human story that he wanted to tell. And as I say, I was quite impressed by that. I really was. So, yeah, and again, it comes through primarily, initially, I thought, really in the Stone Tools. So, well done again. Real achievement. Thank you. I'm going to let you go. I'm going to go, and we can go and get some sleep. But
thank you very much.
Thank you for your time this evening. It's been a real pleasure.
Fantastic.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.